Having a conversation today with a gentleman who was there at a kind of a pivotal time in my life. I was coming out of Christianity. I was I was in the middle of deconstruction, stumbled upon his book, Godless, and it made an amazing impact. So it's always cool when I get a chance to cross paths with Dan Barker. He is the author of many books. He was an evangelical, hardcore Sunday go-to-meeting preacher for a great many years. And now he is co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and author of a new book called Contraduction. Dan, it's good to have you back, brother.
Good to see you again. I've also been influenced by your books, too. So I guess it's a cross-pollination here. But I do have a complaint, Seth.
Okay.
You gave me one of your wonderful mugs, the Thinking Atheist mugs, and you signed it, but your signature is washing off. And I don't know.
I think that's symbolic.
No,
that's
symbolic,
indicative of my life.
Is that it? I have to get another one.
I'm fading over time as a human being, so I think this is probably symbolic of my life. The subtitle of your book fascinates me: "The Hidden Fallacy That Inverts Reality." I feel like we live in an inverted reality. I mean, just as far as the headlines, the people I live around. You ever feel that way, Dan?
Well, yeah, and that was kind of the point of the book. And by the way, the publisher took the subtitle off the book. It's just now called Contraduction. And I had wanted to subtitle the book The Death of the Design Argument. But contraduction, as you point out, it's a new word. And it's still not in the dictionary, but a lot of people are embracing it and using it. It's a fallacy that inverts reality. We get things totally wrong. And like I said in that debate, you were at that debate in Florida where this whole thing started. It's kind of like the guy who's so impressed at how did they make all those rivers flow right along the state border? How did they do that? It must have been an immense, expensive civic project to exquisitely fine-tune those rivers to perfectly match the borders. Well, of course, that's backward, right? It's inverted. It's what I call contradictory. If you think about things the wrong way around, you won't see the real picture. And this, of course, applies to what a lot of people say is the strongest argument. It's not a great argument, but the strongest argument for a God is the fine-tuning argument, where we think, look how the universe is exquisitely fine-tuned for life. Well, you can see where that's going, can't you?
It's a word that you made up? Is it a Dan Barker word?
It is a Dan Barker word. In fact, you were there. Do you remember the debate in Florida a couple of years ago?
Mm-hmm. I was there.
You gave a talk at the Free Flow, and I was debating Adam Lloyd Johnson. And during his opening statement, if you remember, he said, I'm not going to argue for the biblical God. I'm arguing for mere theism using abductive reasoning. And I thought, abductive, how often do we hear that word? Well, I knew what it meant. And as I got up in my rebuttal, I said, abductive is the weakest kind of reasoning. It's really just kind of a best guess, the best explanation. And I said, I think Adam's thinking is backwards, it's reversed. And what we need, and you can see this during the debate, I was ad-libbing. I was thinking, we need a new word, not abductive. We need a word. And I said, how about postductive? We need a word that shows it wrong, that is flipped around wrong. And the audience did not seem impressed with that because I was just ad-libbing. But later I was thinking, what word do we need? We don't need a prefix that means after. We need a prefix that means inverted. So contraductive. We have deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, abductive reasoning, for whatever that's worth. And I think we have a fallacy that precedes the reasoning called contraduction, where if your premise that you start with is reversed, your whole argument is wrong.
Dan, how many debates, just ballpark, how many debates have you done over the years?
I don't need a ballpark. I've been keeping track since 1985, February, where I did my first debate as an atheist with Dr. Rubel Shelley in Nashville, Tennessee. I have done 140 formal, public, moderated, timed debates, like the one that you saw, 140 of them. And I don't count informal debates or TV talk show debates or radio debates as actual debates. So I don't count the debate I did with William Lane Craig on national TV because it wasn't a formal moderated debate. It was more like a, casual conversation. So 140 debates as of right now.
I'm going to come back to William Lane Craig in just a second because he's famous for Kalam, and we'll explain for those who don't know what the Kalam cosmological argument is. Do you find that when you're talking to just every people, they're not, theologians, they're not apologists or don't play in that sandbox, some of that stuff gets really esoteric, especially when it comes to the lofty language that comes out of the mouths of the experts, the God defenders. They go way off into the weeds. Do you ever find people kind of glazing over, checking out, like you've got to literally rope them and drag them back into the conversation?
Well, yeah, because there are these specialty fields like the philosophy of religion or philosophy subfields like fine tuning and all of these words that are very important and useful words that the experts use to talk among themselves with, but the people on the street aren't part of that little subculture. And so it sounds like gobbledygook, which is kind of why when Adam Johnson used that phrase, I'm going to use abductive reasoning, I wanted to kind of demystify the word. It's just a fancy word that just means, hey, it's our best guess, And so you can say the same things using simpler words, but you're right. I was walking by the Jehovah's Witness booth on campus a few weeks ago, and this young man there was telling me about the truth, and we get along pretty well. And so I stopped and I asked the guy. He seemed educated. I asked him, "Oh, so tell me, what is your epistemology?" And he just stared at me. Huh? What is your epistemology? And he goes, "What does that word mean?" So he's college educated, but he doesn't even know the word epistemology. And I guess I don't blame him. If you're not running in that little circle or that circle of thought, you're not going to know those words.
Yeah, but how much of that do you think is, I know this is a subjective opinion, but with 100 and whatever debates under your belt, how much of that is just the weaponization of language to impress, right? Let me use a lot of syllables, therefore I shall sound credible. It's almost like those, intelligent design apologists who talk about the quantum, and they just go way off into these really lofty sounding terms to overwhelm people and sound credible.
Well, then they're bad debaters, because the debater is supposed to relate to the audience and communicate with an audience in ways that an audience will understand. And if I don't think they're always obfuscating. I think they genuinely use those words because they're common words to them in their field. But it almost sounds like sometimes they're talking down to the audience. I did an audience with Richard Howe. We did 2 debates. I did one in Florida and then another one at the Apologist Conference for the Southern Evangelical Seminary. And Richard Howe, at the first debate we did, he got up before that university audience in, not Tampa, the university there. And he had brought a big trunk with him, and he unloaded the trunk and put the stack of books by the podium on the floor. And during the debate, he was telling these students, you're not going to understand any of this unless you've read as much as I have. And there's so much depth behind all of this. In a debate tonight, we're not going to be able to go too deep. So trust me, I have read all these books. Look at them. And of course, that backfired. That was like insulting the audience. And yeah, you can refer to authority. I refer to authority sometimes, but mainly to quote what they say, not just to say, hey, look, there's all these authorities. So if your only argument or if your main argument is an argument from authority, you don't really have an argument that'll stand on its own feet.
You talked about the rivers that outline the states and how amazing it is that those were created just to border us. I'm reminded, I think it was a Douglas Adams argument that talked about the pothole in the rainstorm. And the water had gone up and it said, wow, look, this pothole is made perfectly for me. The edges are formed and the depth is absolutely perfect. This must have been designed with me in mind. Would that be a contraduction, Dan?
It would be, yes, if such a thing actually happened. I mean, it's a good metaphor, I suppose. Another one would be Look at the human nose. Look how perfectly shaped the human nose is to support a pair of eyeglasses. How do you explain that? Look at the perfect fit, you know? So that's contraduction. That's just thinking the wrong way around. I think the earliest and most powerful contradiction in the human species is the idea or the impression that the sun rises. Every morning the sun rises, right? Well, actually it doesn't. It's only because from our point of view, we are looking at the world like I think all organisms have to start from their own point of view. And it looks like the sun is rising, assuming a geocentric or a flat earth concept. But actually the sun is not rising. That's contradictory. It is we who are rising. And so we use the word sunrise. Even those of us who know that it doesn't mean what it says, we know the sun's not rising, we still use the word, which is just a convention of language, I suppose. Because what else would we call it? Oh, look, the horizon set. You know, I mean, that's a weird way to flip your mind around. And the illustration I start the book off with, and by the way, thanks for giving me a good endorsement on it. Have you ever been sitting on a train that's not moving when the train next to you starts to move and you briefly think it's you who's moving? Or, you know, on a plane or a car? I think this happened to all of us, and we get it totally backward because we're looking at it from our point of view rather than from outside of our point of view. That's contradiction.
Do me a favor, for those not aware, define the Kalam cosmological argument.
So Kalam is an ancient Islamic word that for Islamic scholars who first developed this idea that since you can't have an infinite series of preceding events, there had to be a first event, right? Because if there was an infinite series of preceding events, we never could have got to now, but we have got to now. So that means there must have been a beginning. That Kalam argument has been spruced up in modern times with the knowledge of the Big Bang. And people like William Lane Craig and others are saying, well, now the Big Bang shows that, in fact, indeed, there was a first event, the Big Bang. And so the argument goes, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. On its face, that reasoning is valid. It's a good deductive argument, assuming the premises are true. But it turns out that the conclusion is not valid. The conclusion is not sound. It's, well, in my book, I explained that this really a category error is what's happening here.
I think Kalam was added after they started with just a cosmological position. The universe has a cause, or everything that is has a cause or something. But then they added the word begins, I think, because they wanted a starting block where they could, I guess, stick God with a starting pistol there at the beginning of the race. And it seems to be a deistic. Oh, go ahead, Dan. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the idea of beginning was implicit within the early Kalam argument, the Islamic.
I see.
Because of the impossibility of an infinite preceding events, you know, but yeah.
Dan, isn't that just a deistic claim, if that? I mean, when I see William Lane Craig, and I've been to his website, it talks about everything that begins to exist has a cause. And then there's just paragraphs, pages of word salad, and a huge canyon-sized leap to his specific deity with a proper name. But Kalam itself is not a theistic position, right?
It's just, the Kalam itself is just supports the theistic position, supports it in that there must have been a beginning or a first cause.
Yeah, but I mean, in all these debates, how do they get from point A to point Z?
Well, in the debate that you saw that prompted this new book with Adam Lloyd Johnson, he was honest enough to say that I'm not arguing for the God of the Bible here tonight. I'm arguing basically for mere theism, whatever that means. And there's another book coming out about that debate, and I'm asking, well, what is mere theism? Are we supposed to offer it mere worship? You know, obviously he's a Christian, and he has a Christian organization called Convincing Proof, but he came to the debate unwilling to defend his own personal God. He just wanted to defend this concept. So the Kalam argument and and the fine-tuning argument, other types of these arguments, are really just an attempt to give a scientific plausibility that God could then plug into. It's not, those arguments don't prove God, but what they do is they show that their theism is not incompatible with science. Therefore, you are justified in making the leap if you want to go further, like and believe the Bible or believe all those things.
Yeah, and I just released a speech to YouTube where I take on God, the intelligent designer, with some ideas for improvement. So I was talking about bad design, those who are talking about fine-tuning and optimization. I mean, it was everything from the appendix to harmful UV rays to the birth canal to blind fish with eyes. I mean, you name it. But when you get into the concept of contraduction, you get into fine-tuning. How do you approach someone who says, well, man, if the Earth was this much closer, this much further from the sun, we would either fry or freeze? How do you explain that?
And that is the essence of the fine-tuning argument. And it's important to point out that the fine-tuning argument is based on natural laws, natural principles, natural probabilities, and real mathematics, right, in the real world. And so, yeah, it does seem improbable if the universe were tuned for life, that any one of those 20 or so parameters or constants, that could be the forces like force of gravity, electroweak force, the cosmological constant, and so on. There's about 20 or so of them. If any of them were off by the tiniest amount, then life would not be permissible. That's assuming that life is the aim, right? It's like the rivers and the borders, right? It's assuming you've got it backwards. Yes, life would not be permissible, but who in the world said that the cosmos has to be aimed at life being permissible? And in Victor Stenger's book, The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, he was a wonderful man. He died not too long ago. He was an astrophysicist. He concludes, the universe was not fine-tuned for us. We were fine-tuned for the universe. It's like the glasses in the nose, right? You've got it backwards if you think the universe was fine-tuned for us. And he shows that actually it's true that if you mess with one of those constants, oops, the whole thing falls apart. But he shows in his book that if it's like dials, imagine God stumbles upon this primordial soup of constants that he has to like twist them until he finally makes life appear. Victor Stenger shows that, yeah, if you twist this one off this much, then life's not permissible. But if you twist this one this way, like riding a bike, you could stay in balance. You could have a universe that is life permitting, maybe not necessarily carbon-based biological life, but you could have a life permitting universe with other variations of those constants being tuned in a different way. And he gives examples of it. And I can't even understand all of his equations, but he gives the exact examples. And then Lawrence Krauss comes along and he said, well, you know what? Some of those constants are not that fine-tuned. The cosmological constant is very tiny, but it could have been less. In fact, as Krauss points out, if the cosmological constant were even smaller than it is, life would be more probable. So there's all those ways that you can approach it. But I think the basic way is just to go like Gilda Radner on Saturday Night Live. She realized, oops, I got it wrong. And she says, never mind. We're thinking about it the wrong way around. Like we're looking through the wrong side of a telescope. Oops, never mind, I got it wrong. And flip it around, then you can see how things are. It's only because we humans think the cosmos must be aimed at us, because we are all human-centric, that we tie ourselves in knots, kind of like what Ptolemy did with the solar system. In the 2nd century, Ptolemy came up with what's known as the Ptolemaic solar system. He couldn't understand the motion of the planets, so he invented this weird Rube Goldberg machine concept of spheres within spheres to account for their retrograde, and this really complicated thing when all he had to do was realize the sun's not rising, we are. That whole thing just disappeared. You don't even need the argument because there's no question there in the first place.
When you were an evangelical pastor, how much of this was, I guess, what Carl Sagan would have called the folly of human conceits? How much of this was, I want to be superior, right? I'm feeding the ego. I am the center of all things. Did that feed some of your perception about the universe?
Maybe in retrospect, looking back on it, maybe. At the time, I didn't think that. At the time, I thought we humans were worms. We humans were small. We needed to bow down, shackle our wrists, lower our head before the great master, and that the great Lord was deserving of worship, and he's all powerful. And so we're sinners, and we're little, and we need his grace, all of that. So that's what I was thinking as I was preaching, that how great thou art. We were created for his glory. The Westminster Confession, to worship. We are here to give glory to God. So, what is the end of man? So that's what I thought, that there really was a being who was deserving of our worship. And the next book I'm working on is going to address that question. Why do we have this innate instinctive need to worship anything? And I think there's a good adaptive explanation for that, which I'm going to argue. This whole idea, if you look at the postures of prayer, prayer, your hands are shackled, your head is bowed, your knees are bent, you're prostrate on the floor. They're the same postures of slavery. Exactly the same. If you look at it, you go to the airport and you see the chapel sign, there's a person like this kneeled down like this, humbled, little, like I'm praying before the big, great Lord. So in my mind, I had a very negative perception or a negative image of human nature. We were bad, we were little, we were small, we deserved damnation, and we can't do it on our own because we're just not good enough. And we needed the grace and the goodness of this wonderful God.
There is no one worthy, no, not one.
Yeah.
You get into eternal life as a contraduction. Help me understand that. Where are you going?
Well, so I have a chapter in the Contraduction called Life. And a lot of people think life, like it says in the Bible, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that life is something that comes from the outside and inhabits this physical being of ours. And a lot of religions think that we are something that transcends, we are souls. And there's even some non-religious people who think life is some kind, it's called vitalism, that there's something alive that comes into us, as if these boxes, these physical boxes called our bodies, are receptacles for this thing that comes into us. I think that's a contradiction. Life is not something that comes into us from the outside. Life is something that emanates out of us. We measure life by body temperature, at least. We measure life by the movement of the organism. And when the body dies, people ask, when the body dies, where does the soul go? Where does the mind go? Well, mind and soul, if you can use that word soul, mind and consciousness are really just functions of an organism that's working, the brain, right? When the brain is working, nothing's coming into it. When it's working, it's creating this, whatever you want to call it. In fact, we are aware of things, and then when we become aware of the fact that we are aware of things, we create these loops. That's what I think is consciousness, what Daniel Dennett called the center of narrative gravity. So when the body dies and when the stomach dies, nobody asks, where did the digestion go? Because, or when the heart dies, where did the circulation go? The word mind and circulation and digestion are labels for the functioning of the living being. If you see a plane flying over, how does the sound of that airplane travel with the airplane? How does that happen? Well, it's not because the sound is something outside of it. It's produced by it. So when death basically is the cessation of all the organs of the body, and nothing has left, nothing has gone, nothing spooky went out of us somewhere. We just died. When you eat a piece of steak, if you're a meat eater, do you think you're eating a soul when you eat steak? Well, what happened? Where did it go? Well, that's backward thinking. That's thinking that life comes into you when actually life emanates out of you. That's contradictory. So therefore, it can't live on. And I have a whole chapter in the book about time, too. The whole concept of eternal life is an incoherent concept. Just like it's the same with the concept of time travel is also incoherent.
I remember looking at eternity in the Bible after I left the faith. I hadn't really thought it through when I was a believer, except, wow, I get to go on, because I was afraid of death and And I had this very nebulous idea of a happy place with color and light and the family dog and music and mansions and all those things. I hadn't thought about those verses where essentially I sit around and just say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come forever, which does not sound like heaven to me, Dan. Had you explored the concepts of eternity, your own concept, when you were a preacher?
Well, when I was a preacher, it did sound nice to me because I was in love with that Lord. You know what I mean? I was in love with that God that I truly worshiped. And unlike a lot of believers, I actually got goosebumps when I was praying. So I felt this loving, parental, guiding father figure that was with me and that someday I was going to be with him. I mean, to me, that was attractive. I didn't think through all the details about like Woody Allen asks, and the trouble with eternal life is, when does it end? It just, there's no end to it. And in my book, Life Driven Purpose, I point out that real purpose in life, purpose and meaning, comes from trying to solve problems. That's where purpose comes from. We have challenges, we have problems, and whatever they are, we work to solve them. That gives us meaning. But in heaven, there won't be any problems. Heaven will be meaningless and purposeless. And if you believe the book of Revelation, and a lot of Christians didn't in the early days, and some still don't now, heaven is just this big cubic city that comes down and sits on the earth, which is 1,500 miles across. It's a cube, basically, with one street, because there won't be vehicles. I suppose the street of gold is for the king to promenade, to watch out. And basically, we'll spend the whole time just praising that king, which I used to find an attractive thought until, like you, I thought it through and I realized that's kind of pointless. And it's kind of like, you're not even a living being anymore. And there's no sex in heaven. There's no marriage given in heaven. And there won't be any sleep in heaven. So what are your rooms going to be like? What are these mansions going to actually be like? Do you have to eat? Do you have to defecate? Will there be waste management in heaven? I mean, think through the details of it, and it becomes this sort of nebulous, immaterial idea that our souls are going to just blissfully go up. To me, that's the absence of life. That's not life after death. That's like a death after death.
There you are in the pose of the slave, right? You're on your knees with your hands together and you are bowing to the great king as he parades by. Total digression. This is not in the book, but maybe it relates. Somebody had said they were talking about why. It was an apologist, like an armchair apologist, talking about why there's so much awfulness, so much suffering on this planet. And one of the sort of the knee-jerk responses is free will. Well, God gave us free will, and we chose poorly, and things went to hell, literally. And so then the next question is, well, will there be any strife or pain or cancer or abuse or any of those things? Infant death. Will any of that stuff happen in heaven? And they say no. Well, then are you saying that there is no free will in heaven? And then their brain explodes. I don't know. Is that a bad argument, Dan?
Well, I guess it's not incoherent to make that argument. I mean, if they're going
that's
to...
a compliment. Thanks, Dan. That's Seth,
No,
you're not totally incoherent.
No, I'm saying their argument is not incoherent.
Oh, okay.
Not yours. Yeah, your point is very, very good. But their argument, I think, is within the context of their faith system is not incoherent. But yeah, you're right. If they're saying, and I don't think they would all say this, that free will exists so that we can deal with these problems in life, and there won't be any free will in heaven, because if you're going to worship God for eternity, would you have the freedom not to? Apparently, that's what happened with Lucifer. Lucifer was a created being who somehow had the free will to change his or its or their mind. So I do have a chapter in the book about free will, which I think is also an illustration of contraductive thinking. And to make a really long story short, it's kind of like looking in a mirror. When you look in a mirror, you think left and right are reversed, but they're not. It's really front and back that's reversed in the mirror. And if you can flip that around, you're actually not looking at yourself in the mirror. You are looking with yourself in the mirror. And so the problem goes away. We imagine that person's looking back at us, but it actually is looking through the paper with us. So with free will, the analogy I use is that looking backward, looking to the past, I think, and many philosophers and scientists think, it's obvious that there's no such thing as libertarian free will. It's all determined. If you look back and you can look at all the previous causes that led to your event. But flipping around, like looking in the mirror and looking forward, looking into the future, since we don't know the future, we don't know what it's going to be now. We will later. We'll know what happened. We have this illusion that mirror is looking back at it. We have this illusion that since I'm free to make my choice between now and then, even though looking backward we'll know you or not, at least for now we have this illusion. I think, and some people think it's a pernicious illusion. I think it's a beautiful illusion, kind of like the illusion of depth perception, which helps us navigate the world. I think free will is an illusion, but it's a useful illusion in the meantime. Before you make your final decision, you have that gap. And by the way, if there's a God who knows the future, he also knows his own future decisions. He cannot look forward and have a period of uncertainty during which he's going to, what should I do? He knows in advance. Therefore, he doesn't have free will. A God who knows the future cannot have free will. I know they try to argue out of that by saying, well, he's a timeless being, whatever that means. He exists outside of time. But free will, in the illustration you gave, I think raises another serious problem, in that God created Adam and Eve, and God is a perfect being, and he can only create perfect things, and yet he gave Adam and Eve free will, and for some reason, Eve chose wrong. Eve exercised her supposed free will, and she made the wrong choice. Aha! Now the human race is damned because she made this wrong choice. Seems like we inherited it, doesn't it? It's like it's in our genes or something. But why did Eve make the wrong choice? There was obviously some flaw in her nature, if you believe the story. I don't believe the story, but if the story's true, why did Eve make the wrong choice? There was something wrong with her before she made that wrong decision. Who created that flaw? If Eve was created by God with a flaw, who created that flaw and who's responsible for it? So what good is the free will defense in that case?
And this is again a digression. I'll come back to the end of the book in just a second, but it becomes infinite regress, doesn't it? If we don't have free will, but then we ask God to change what his will is, then we're asking a perfect plan to be altered. So was it imperfect to begin with? Or was God expecting us to pray because he foreknew we would drop to our knees and petition him for some alteration, some miracle, whatever? And then he's holding the answer hostage, but he meant to do it. I mean, you've gone in this sort of hamster wheel, right? I mean, it's maddening after a while.
Well, there's a big theological word, kenosis, which just means that God emptied himself when Jesus came. And so God created this physical universe with risk in it, with problems in it, and with suffering in it, so that we could then test our free will against that. If God had not created this big mess of a universe we're in, then we would just be robots. We would just be like the angels. So God is temporarily, willingly allowing the universe we live in to be a degraded state within which then we can exercise. And those few of us who do turn around and say yes to God, he's going to bless them. And the rest, of course, are either abolished or go into eternal torment, depending on your theology. So it's all done for a test. And in one of the theodicies that some Christian apologists and theologians offer is what's called the character building or the soul building analogy, that the reason we have suffering and evil is so that we can grow from it and become stronger. And how in the world could that happen unless there were challenges and obstacles and threats and risk in the real world?
I know Dr. Norman Geisler used to say that you have to have the crooked line so that we know what the straight line looks like. And his argument partially was, well, how would we know what good is unless God contrasted it against evil. And then with the evil, he can demonstrate his great goodness. So evil becomes a utility. I think it was in Isaiah 45 where it was said that God created evil in the first place. Again, whole other conversation. As we draw to a close, I remember I'm trying to think of the university. It's about a half an hour east of here, northeastern state maybe. It was a debate. It was an atheist and an apologist. And the apologist said something fascinating. He said, if I wasn't a Christian, I'd probably be a murderer. I mean, he just said something like that on the stage. If it wasn't for Jesus, who knows why? I could be a rapist or a murderer or something like that. And I remember the atheist guy said, well, in your case, I'm kind of glad you're a Christian, right? I mean, in your case, it might be a good thing to be a Christian. But I find that claim a bit insulting. Right? If you didn't have my God, you could be, I saw one on Twitter this morning, you would be a criminal. So you get into ethics, morality. How do we know right and wrong in the book Contraduction? You want to give me just a primer, kind of set it up?
Well, first of all, if we look at the example of God in the Bible, he himself was the genocidal murderer and what I would call the immoral character. But I think morality is one of the chapters in the book, Contraduction, is an example of contradiction itself, and that we think morality should be top down, when really morality is bottom up. We don't measure our actions, or we shouldn't measure our actions by the decrees and the commands of some big lord and master. That's what the masters want, right? To know what is right and wrong, because then right and wrong just becomes a matter of the decree of the master. But real morality, and I don't think there's such a thing as objective moral values, but I do think the values that we hold in our mind that we call moral can be objectively justified, not by referring to this top-down model, but by flipping it contradictively and referring to the real world. We measure, morality is really a measure of harm. And the way to be a moral person is to act with the intention of minimizing harm. And harm, whatever it is, it's natural. Harm is something real. You can name 1,000 things that are harmful. And so to measure our moral values, we would refer to the natural world, bottom up. What are the actual consequences of my action, of my decisions? What are the actual fruit? Should I put this chemical in the river, or should I use this harm? You know what I mean? That's how we determine what is right and wrong, by actual reference, justifiably referencing objectively in the real world rather than following orders.
I will say, I'm like you, I'm a frontline guy. I've read a lot of books, listened to a lot of audiobooks along these lines, but I've never seen or read or heard anything quite like Contraduction. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was sort of glad to preview it when you had sent it out, which is why I had the subtitle, because it still had that at the beginning. But I've never heard the inversion phrased and compiled in this specific way. It really is kind of a remarkable, and it's an easily digestible book. It's not like War and Peace. I mean, this is something somebody could probably read in a weekend, right?
Well, A.C. Grayling, the eminent British philosopher, he read it in one day, he said. And in fact, he put a blurb on the book. So it is short, and it's spread out. It's got some cute illustrations by Marcos Telias, who's a physician in Santiago, Chile. And so I think it's a fun book. I think it's light, and I think it just scratches the surface. And I invite readers to offer examples of their own, from their own field, of what they think is contradictory thinking. So it's starting a conversation.
I'm going to petition the dictionary, like Webster's dictionary. This is a word that probably should be included in the future. So any final thoughts on the book before I let you go? I mean, just give me the brochure real fast.
You should petition Steven Pinker, because he's the editor of the American Heritage Dictionary, and he actually gave a blurb to the book. Contradiction is an innocent fallacy that happens to all of us, and it does, not just with religion. It can be all sorts of things in life. It can be, free will or sleep, or it can be looking in the mirror. It can be looking at the sunrise. And in order to combat that and to minimize the risk of having faulty premises before your logic even begins, we have to actively look errors and fallacies in our own mind. We have to actively look, kind of like a continuity supervisor in a movie production, looking to make sure that in the scenes everything fits together. The viewer of the movie doesn't look for that stuff, but the continuity supervisor does. And so I challenge most readers to be their own continuity supervisors and look for areas where we might indeed be flipping our impression of reality.
Ex-evangelical, author, hero, legend, brother, Dan Barker. Man, it's always good to cross paths. I'll link the book in the description box. All success with it. Good stuff. And let's talk soon, okay?
Thank you, Seth. You're a real brother, not in Christ.